On the morning of June 7, 1944, somewhere along the cliffs overlooking a beach in northern France, a young soldier from the American forces crouched in a crater created by naval bombardment, his rifle gripped tightly in mud-slicked hands. The sound of distant artillery rolled across the landscape like thunder that refused to end, a continuous percussion that had been going on for so long that it had become almost background noise, noticed only when it stopped. Around him, dozens of other soldiers huddled in similar positions, waiting for orders that would send them forward against fortified positions that had already claimed countless lives in the preceding hours. They believed, as soldiers often do in such moments, that survival depended on staying together, on moving as a unit, on the strength of numbers and coordinated assault. They were about to learn how profoundly wrong that assumption could be. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over the next 72 hours would demonstrate how a single individual, operating with methods that defied conventional military doctrine, could achieve what entire companies had failed to accomplish, and in doing so, would earn a nickname from his adversaries that spoke to both fear and a grudging respect, born from sheer bewilderment at capabilities that seemed to exceed normal human limits. The soldier in question was Private First Class Vernon Baker, though that name meant nothing yet to the German defenders who had spent months fortifying the positions above the beaches. Baker had grown up in Cheyenne, Wyoming, one of the few places in America where a young man of African descent could find some measure of acceptance, though even there the boundaries of that acceptance were clearly marked and ruthlessly enforced. He had joined the segregated units of the American military in 1943, assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division, a unit composed entirely of soldiers who shared his skin color, commanded mostly by white officers who ranged from genuinely committed to barely concealing their doubts about whether such men could fight effectively against determined opposition. The battalion had landed in Italy months earlier, participating in the grinding campaign up the peninsula that had tested every unit involved beyond what peacetime training could possibly prepare them for. Baker had already distinguished himself in ways that his commanding officers noted in reports that somehow never translated into the recognition that white soldiers received for similar actions. He had developed a reputation for patience, for observation, for an uncanny ability to move through terrain as though he understood its contours, on some instinctive level that went beyond mere training or experience. Other soldiers joked that he could disappear in an open field, that he moved with the silence of smoke drifting through still air, that enemy positions seemed to empty themselves before he arrived, though of course that last part was impossible. Positions did not empty themselves through some supernatural intervention. Someone had to clear them, had to neutralize the defenders, had to transform occupied ground into secured territory through direct action. On this particular morning, as dawn broke over terrain that had been contested for days, Baker's unit had been tasked with advancing on a series of fortified positions that overlooked a critical supply route. The strategic importance of this route could not be overstated. It represented the primary means by which reinforcements and supplies could reach forward positions, and as long as the German forces controlled the high ground overlooking it, that route remained effectively unusable. Convoys attempting passage faced withering fire from positions that seemed immune to counter-battery fire that absorbed artillery bombardment and emerged still operational that had defied every conventional attempt to dislodge them. The German forces had constructed these defenses with characteristic thoroughness, concrete bunkers reinforced with steel beams, scavenged from destroyed buildings, interlocking fields of fire that turned the approach into a killing ground where attackers died in the open with no cover, adequate to protect them. Observation posts positioned to provide advance warning of any assault developing from expected directions. Previous attempts to dislodge the defenders had failed with such consistency that some officers had begun suggesting they simply bypass the positions and accept the losses to supply convoys that would inevitably result, calculating that sporadic casualties to supply personnel might be preferable to the concentrated casualties that assault on prepared positions would certainly produce. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Reynolds, The officer commanding the assault had other ideas. Reynolds was one of those rare officers who had earned his men's respect through demonstrated competence rather than merely inherited authority or the automatic deference that rank commanded. He had been studying the German positions for 3 days, watching through binoculars and studying aerial reconnaissance photographs, noting patterns in their patrols, gaps in their observation, moments when attention seemed to waver as defenders focused on immediate concerns rather than maintaining constant vigilance. He had also been studying his own men, trying to identify who among them possessed the particular combination of skills that might succeed, where conventional tactics had failed so completely. He kept coming back to Baker, to reports of how this particular soldier moved, how he seemed to possess instincts for terrain and timing that went beyond what training provided, how other soldiers spoke of him with a mixture of respect and slight bewilderment, as though they recognized capability without quite understanding its source or full extent. Reynolds called Baker to his command post that morning, a glorified hole in the ground covered with salvaged timber and camouflage netting that provided protection from shell fragments but would offer no defense against direct hit. Inside, maps covered every available surface, marked with symbols that represented death and potential death, success and likely failure. The accumulated intelligence gathered from reconnaissance and prisoner interrogation, and the bitter lessons of failed assaults. Reynolds looked at Baker with an expression that mixed calculation with something that might have been respect, might have been recognition of capability that transcended the prejudices that permeated the military hierarchy, even in units specifically formed to demonstrate that African American soldiers could perform as effectively as any others. "What I'm about to ask you to do," Reynolds said carefully, choosing his words with deliberation, "goes against everything taught in infantry school. Everything. The doctrine says you mass forces, you provide covering fire, you advance in coordinated waves with mutual support, you overwhelm defensive positions through superior numbers and firepower. But doctrine was written by people who never faced these particular positions, held by these particular defenders, arranged in this particular terrain with these specific characteristics that make conventional approaches suicide." Baker waited, understanding that Reynolds was working his way towards something significant, building to a request that required careful framing because of its implications and dangers. Reynolds pointed to the map, his finger tracing a route that wove between the marked positions like a thread through a needle's eye, passing through spaces that doctrine said should not exist, that conventional military analysis insisted could not be traversed unseen. "There is a path here," he said, "not a path in the conventional sense. No trail, no cleared ground, nothing that shows up on maps or reconnaissance photographs, but a route that uses the terrain, uses the dead ground that lies outside observation from the bunker positions, uses the moments when their attention is focused elsewhere because human vigilance cannot remain perfect indefinitely. A route that one man moving alone, moving with extraordinary care and skill, might traverse without being detected, and once past their outer defenses, once behind their positions operating from angles they do not expect and have not prepared to defend against, that one man might accomplish what a company could not, might neutralize positions that have cost us dozens of casualties already." Baker studied the map intently, his mind already translating the symbols and contour lines into actual terrain, into sight lines and shadows, into the physics of sound propagation and the psychology of defenders who had grown accustomed to facing frontal assaults, who had learned to expect threat from certain directions and might not maintain equal vigilance against approaches that seemed impossible. "How many positions are we discussing?" he asked, his voice level and professional. Giving no indication whether he found the proposal reasonable or insane, Reynolds hesitated, and in that hesitation, Baker understood the magnitude of what was being suggested. 9 fortified bunkers, Reynolds finally said, each one covering the others with mutually supporting fire. Each one capable of stopping a platoon-sized assault, and has already done exactly that on 2 separate occasions. But most of them are oriented outward, expecting threat from the obvious directions below them, from the valleys and approaches that any attacking force would logically use. They are not expecting threat from their rear, from their flanks, from angles that should be impossible to approach unseen. because the terrain does not seem to offer concealment adequate for such approach. And you want me to clear all 9 positions? Baker kept his voice carefully neutral, though the magnitude of what Reynolds was suggesting had certainly not escaped him. 9 fortified bunkers, each designed to withstand assault, each manned by defenders who had months to perfect their positions and procedures. All of them interconnected through communications and mutually supporting fields of fire. "I want you to try," Reynolds said, and his voice carried unusual intensity. "I want you to move as you know how to move, utilizing that ability you have demonstrated, that thing that makes you vanish even when people are looking directly in your direction, that allows you to traverse ground that should not permit unseen passage. I cannot order you to do this. This is beyond what any order could reasonably demand, beyond what any soldier could be required to accept. But I am asking, as one soldier to another who understands what is at stake here, whether you believe it is possible, whether you think you possess the skills necessary to attempt this mission with reasonable expectation of success, rather than certain death." Baker looked at the map for a long moment, calculating distances and timing, the stamina required to move through hostile terrain while maintaining the constant vigilance that survival would demand, the concentration necessary to evaluate every sight and sound for threat indicators, while simultaneously planning approach routes and withdrawal options. When he looked up, his expression had settled into something that Reynolds would later describe in his report as quiet confidence. Though that phrase failed to capture the complexity of what it meant for a man in Baker's position, to volunteer for a mission that would either earn him a medal or an unmarked grave with no body to send home, and perhaps no accurate record of what he had attempted. "I will need darkness for the initial infiltration," Baker said, already thinking through tactical requirements. "I will need their attention focused elsewhere during the critical phases when I am most exposed. And I will need to know that no friendly forces will be in the operational area, because I cannot differentiate targets while I am working and cannot risk encountering friendly patrols who might mistake me for enemy infiltrator and compromise the entire mission." Reynolds nodded with visible relief that Baker had agreed to attempt the mission. "We will stage a demonstration at their eastern positions at 2100 hours, he said. "Enough noise and light to make them believe a major assault is forming in that sector. Artillery fire, machine gun fire, the whole show. That should pull observation in that direction and keep their attention focused away from your actual approach route. You will have approximately a 4-hour window before dawn makes continued movement impossible, and you will be exposed to observation from multiple positions simultaneously." Baker thought about that timeline carefully, about what could be accomplished in 4 hours of darkness, about how many positions one man could infiltrate and neutralize before the sun revealed his presence, and transformed the mission from possible to suicidal. It was barely enough time, demanding extraordinary efficiency and accepting significant risk, but barely enough would have to suffice because that was what the situation offered. The day passed in that strange suspension of time that precedes dangerous undertaking, hours that felt simultaneously endless and far too brief, every moment weighted with awareness of what evening would bring. Baker checked his equipment with meticulous care that went beyond normal pre-mission routine, understanding that a loose buckle, a piece of metal that might clink at the wrong moment, a boot sole that might squeak on certain surfaces, could mean the difference between success and discovery, between completing the mission and dying in hostile territory. He stripped his rifle down completely and reassembled it multiple times, testing each mechanism until he could operate the weapon by touch alone, in complete darkness, without any sound that might betray his presence. He studied aerial reconnaissance photographs until he could close his eyes and visualize the terrain as though standing within it, could mentally walk the approach routes and identify potential obstacles or opportunities that two-dimensional images only hinted at. Other soldiers watched these preparations with expressions that mingled curiosity and concern. They knew Baker was being sent on some special assignment, though the specific details remained classified and limited to those with operational need to know. Some of them approached to offer words of encouragement, awkward phrases that revealed their own uncertainty about how to express solidarity with someone about to undertake something they could not fully comprehend, and were grateful not to have been asked to attempt themselves. Baker accepted these gestures with quiet grace, understanding that these men were doing their best with the limited vocabulary that military culture provided for such moments, that they were reaching across the boundaries that segregation and prejudice erected to acknowledge shared humanity and mutual respect. As afternoon faded into evening and evening into darkness, Baker went through final preparations with ritual care. He applied dark camouflage paint to his face and hands, eliminating any surfaces that might catch light and reveal his position. He adjusted his equipment repeatedly until everything sat exactly right, until nothing shifted or rattled or created any sound beyond the whisper of cloth against cloth. He consumed a light meal, understanding that hunger would become factor during extended operation, but that full stomach would create discomfort and potentially slow his reactions. As night fell complete and dense, the demonstration began on schedule with precision that spoke to careful coordination. Artillery opened up on the eastern German positions, not a serious bombardment intended to destroy, but enough to create noise and light and the convincing appearance of preliminary fire-preparing ground for infantry assault. Machine guns joined in shortly after, their tracers arcing through the darkness in patterns designed to suggest multiple firing positions, preparing to support attacking forces. Through binoculars, Reynolds and his staff watched the German positions react exactly as predicted, observation shifting toward the threatened sector, reinforcements moving from reserve positions toward areas where attack seemed imminent, attention drawing away from the approach Baker would take, creating the window of opportunity that the entire plan depended upon. Baker moved into position at the edge of the perimeter, a shadow among shadows, indistinguishable from the landscape to anyone not looking directly at his specific location. He carried his rifle, ammunition sufficient for extended engagement, but not so much that weight would slow him, grenades that would provide options for different tactical situations, water, because dehydration destroyed judgment and physical capability, and nothing else. No rations beyond what he had already consumed, no extra equipment that might create weight or bulk or sound, nothing that was not absolutely essential to mission completion. He had calculated that if the operation took longer than 4 hours, the presence or absence of food would be irrelevant, because dawn would expose him regardless of nutritional status. The first 100 meters were the most critical phase, moving away from friendly positions into the no-man's land that separated the forces, the contested ground that neither side fully controlled. This terrain had been fought over repeatedly, shelled by both sides, traversed by patrols from opposing forces until the earth itself seemed traumatized, torn and reshaped by violence until its original contours were lost beneath layers of destruction and debris. Craters overlapped craters, shattered trees lay like broken bones. The smell of decay permeated everything, a constant reminder of costs already paid for ground that would be fought over again. Baker navigated this landscape with patience that transcended mere caution, understanding that each step required evaluation, that the placement of every footfall mattered, because loose dirt might shift audibly, because stepping on concealed debris might create sound that would carry across the quiet moments between artillery rounds. Movement had to flow like water, continuous but adapting to every obstacle, pausing when necessary, but never stopping completely, because complete stillness created its own signature that trained observers might detect. He reached the base of the hill where the German positions were located without incident, though incident felt like an inadequate word for what he had avoided. He had passed within meters of listening posts, had frozen motionless as patrols moved past close enough that he could hear their breathing and quiet conversation, had breathed so shallowly that the rise and fall of his chest would not create movement that might catch peripheral vision. The first bunker loomed above him now, concrete and steel jutting from the hillside like a geometric growth that violated the landscape's natural contours, its firing slits dark rectangles that could erupt with deadly fire at any moment if defenders detected his presence. Baker studied the bunker from concealment, observing for a full 10 minutes before considering any movement, watching for patterns in how defenders operated, listening to voices drifting from within, speaking in German words he could not understand, but in tones he recognized as the casual conversation of men who believed themselves secure. They were discussing something. He guessed from the rhythm and inflection, probably food or women or home, the universal topics of soldiers who had convinced themselves that danger would announce itself with noise and obvious threat, rather than arriving silently from unexpected directions. The structure itself showed evidence of considerable engineering effort. The walls were thick, reinforced concrete, designed to withstand direct artillery hits. The firing slits were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire with adjacent positions. Ventilation pipes emerged from the rear, necessary for occupants to breathe, but also representing potential vulnerability if someone could approach unseen. The entrance faced away from the expected threat axis, protected by the hillside itself and positioned to be invisible from below, unless attacker could somehow reach elevated position that defenders maintained constant watch over. Baker noted all these details, filing them away for future reference, understanding that each bunker would present similar challenges, but also similar vulnerabilities. The Germans had built well, but they had built to defend against expected threats using conventional military logic. They had not anticipated someone like Baker, moving with capabilities that seemed to exceed normal human limits, approaching from angles that should not permit unseen passage, operating alone when doctrine insisted that combat required coordinated action by units. The approach to the entrance required crossing 5 meters of open ground, exposed to observation from multiple positions if anyone happened to be looking in that direction at that specific moment. Those 5 meters represented the most dangerous phase of infiltrating this first position, the moment when all his skill and planning could be negated by simple bad luck, by a defender happening to glance in precisely the wrong direction at precisely the wrong time. Baker waited until the demonstration fire reached a crescendo, the artillery and machine guns creating such cacophony that attention would be drawn irresistibly toward that direction, that even disciplined defenders would find their focus pulled toward the apparent threat developing in the sector under bombardment. Then he moved, a fluid rush that carried him across the gap and against the wall beside the entrance before any mind could process what peripheral vision might have registered. Inside the bunker, 3 soldiers were operating a heavy machine gun position, maintaining watch through firing slits that looked outward toward approaches they expected attackers to use, while a 4th rested on a bunk against the wall, apparently taking opportunity to sleep during his off-duty period. The interior smelled of unwashed bodies, stale cigarette smoke, and the particular combination of oil and metal that permeated all military equipment. Maps covered one wall, marked with defensive positions and predetermined firing coordinates. Personal effects lay scattered about, photographs of loved ones, letters from home, the small tokens that helped soldiers maintain connection to lives they had left behind. Baker entered in silence, moving behind them like wind moving through an open window. What happened next took less than 6 seconds, but would be recounted in German after-action reports with bewilderment that approached the metaphysical. The soldiers simply stopped functioning as military assets. No shots fired, no alarm raised, no extended struggle that might alert adjacent positions. Just 4 men who transitioned from alive and operational to neutralized so quickly that the war moved on without their participation, without their presence or absence making any difference to the broader strategic situation that would ultimately determine this conflict's outcome. Baker took a moment to examine the bunker's interior more thoroughly, noting the communication lines that connected it to other positions through field telephone system, the supplies stacked against the walls representing days of food and ammunition, the personal effects that spoke to the humanity of men who had moments before been operational defenders of strategic positions. He cut the communication lines with his knife, severing the connection that would allow this position to report contact or call for support. Then he moved to the next position, understanding that time was already becoming factor, that the window of darkness would not last forever, and each minute spent was a minute lost from the total available. The second bunker proved more challenging because its entrance was visible from a 3rd position higher up the slope, creating mutual observation that the Germans had designed specifically to prevent the kind of infiltration Baker was attempting. He could not simply rush across open ground because defenders in the higher position would see him, but he could not wait indefinitely because each passing minute brought dawn closer and reduced his operational window. Baker observed the patterns carefully, watching through field glasses he had brought specifically for this purpose, noting that approximately every 8 minutes someone would walk past the observation slit in the higher position, breaking the sight line for approximately 4 seconds. Not much time, but enough if he moved with precision and speed. He counted through 3 cycles to verify the pattern remained consistent, confirming that this was routine rather than coincidence. Then he prepared himself mentally for the rush, visualizing the exact movements required, the precise path he would take, eliminating all hesitation that might slow him fractionally and turn 4 seconds into insufficient time. When the next cycle came, he exploded into motion, covering the distance in a sprint that would have impressed any track coach, reaching the entrance and disappearing inside before the observer in the higher position returned to his post. This bunker housed 5 soldiers, 2 on watch and 3 sleeping in bunks that lined one wall. The space was slightly larger than the first bunker, but arranged similarly, with the heavy weapon positioned to cover designated fields of fire, communication equipment linking it to the network, supplies adequate to sustain defenders through extended period without resupply. Baker moved through it like a force of nature, swift and implacable, and the bunker fell silent before any alarm could be raised, before any of the sleeping soldiers fully awakened to understand what was happening. By the time Baker infiltrated the 3rd bunker, he had refined his approach to an almost surgical precision. He understood now how these positions related to each other in the defensive network, how the defenders' confidence in their interlocking fields of fire created blind spots in their immediate vicinity that they considered irrelevant because those blind spots should be unreachable by any attacker approaching from expected directions. He understood how the very strength of their defensive arrangement created vulnerabilities to someone operating from unexpected angles, someone who had somehow penetrated their outer perimeter and was now working from inside the network itself. He moved with increasing speed and efficiency, each position falling in turn according to methods he had refined through the first 2 infiltrations, the string of fortifications that had held off company-sized assaults succumbing to a single soldier who had somehow slipped through every layer of their defensive network like water flowing through apparently solid rock. The 4th position was different in significant ways. This one housed not just defenders manning weapons, but also served as a communications hub, with radio equipment and telephone lines connecting it to rear headquarters, making it a node in the information network that allowed German forces to coordinate their defenses across multiple positions. Baker could hear the radio operator inside, speaking in German into a handset, reporting status, receiving instructions, maintaining the routine communications that kept the defensive network functioning as a coordinated whole rather than isolated positions operating independently. Neutralizing this position would begin to blind the defensive system, making the remaining positions less able to coordinate response to threats, less able to call for reinforcements or artillery support, more vulnerable to the kind of systematic elimination Baker was executing. He waited until the operator signed off from his transmission, that moment when attention relaxed fractionally after completing a required task, when the mind shifted from concentrated focus to more diffuse awareness. Then he moved, entering the bunker and eliminating the threat so quickly that the radio handset was still dangling from its cord when he exited, heading toward position 5 with efficiency that came from growing familiarity with bunker layouts and defender routines. The 5th bunker presented unexpected complications that forced Baker to adapt his approach. As he crept close enough to observe the entrance, he heard voices raised in what sounded like argument, unusual enough to make him pause and observe more carefully before committing to entry. Through the partially open entrance, he could see 2 soldiers facing each other, one gesturing emphatically while the other shook his head with equal vigor, their body language suggesting conflict over something that mattered to them. They were arguing about something, their attention so focused on each other that they had ceased maintaining proper watch on their assigned sectors, their voices loud enough to mask the slight sounds Baker's approach might create, but also unpredictable enough to create additional risk. Their distraction created opportunity, but also unpredictability that made timing difficult to calculate. People in heightened emotional states were more likely to notice peripheral movement, more likely to react in unexpected ways, more likely to do something irrational that might compromise an approach that depended on predictable behavior. Baker decided to wait, letting the argument run its course, watching as eventually one of the soldiers made a dismissive gesture and turned back to his observation post, while the other muttered what were probably curses in German and returned to his own station. Once they had settled back into routine, once the emotional intensity had dissipated and they had resumed normal vigilance patterns, Baker moved, clearing the position with the same efficient silence that had characterized his previous actions. Position 6 was empty when he arrived, and that created its own concerns that required immediate evaluation. An empty bunker could mean many things, each with different implications for his mission. Baker examined the position carefully, looking for signs of whether it had been abandoned long-term, or whether the defenders had simply stepped out temporarily for reasons that might bring them back at any moment. He found recent cigarette butts still retaining traces of warmth, coffee in a tin cup that had not yet cooled completely, a coat hanging on a hook that still held body heat when he touched it carefully. The defenders had left recently, within the last 10 or 15 minutes, and would likely return soon once whatever task had drawn them away was completed. Baker considered waiting for them, setting up an ambush inside their own bunker that would eliminate them when they returned unsuspecting. But the timeline did not permit such luxury. He had already spent nearly 2 hours on the first 5 positions, and dawn approached with each passing minute. He disabled the weapon system by removing critical components, cut the communication lines to isolate this position from the network, and moved on, knowing that when the defenders returned, they would find their position compromised but uncertain about when or how that compromise had occurred, unable to determine whether they faced immediate threat or had simply experienced some kind of equipment malfunction that happened to coincide with cut communication lines. The 7th position marked a significant transition point in the mission. Baker had now been operating behind enemy lines for approaching 2.5 hours, moving through terrain that every military manual insisted should be impenetrable to solo infiltration, neutralizing positions that doctrine said required platoon-sized assaults with proper support. Fatigue was beginning to accumulate, not the simple exhaustion of physical effort, but the deeper mental strain of maintaining constant alertness, of evaluating every sight and sound for threat indicators, of making life or death decisions repeatedly without any margin for error, without any support or backup if something went wrong. His hands trembled slightly when he examined them, adrenaline and stress combining to create physiological responses that had to be controlled through will and discipline, and the understanding that showing weakness now, allowing fatigue to degrade performance now, would mean failure and death. This bunker was noticeably larger than the others, clearly serving as a command post for the sector, with more soldiers and more equipment visible through observation. Baker could hear conversation inside, multiple voices discussing something in tones that suggested planning or coordination, possibly responding to the ongoing demonstration attack that continued to draw their attention eastward. Taking this position would require a different approach than the careful infiltration that had worked for the smaller bunkers. The increased number of defenders meant he could not simply slip inside and neutralize them before they could react. He needed something faster, more decisive, something that would eliminate multiple threats simultaneously before they could orient to his presence and return fire that would not only kill him, but also alert the remaining positions to the infiltration occurring within their defensive network. He prepared grenades, understanding that the moment he used them, the entire defensive network would be alerted to his presence, would understand that some kind of threat was operating within their perimeter. The remaining positions would have to be taken quickly after this point, before they could organize response or withdrawal, before they could radio for reinforcements or artillery support on their own positions to eliminate whatever threat had penetrated their defenses. He pulled the pins on 3 grenades in rapid succession, let the spoons fly as timing mechanisms began their inexorable countdown, and tossed them through the firing slits with accuracy born from countless hours of training, then moved away from the entrance as the explosions turned the interior of the bunker into chaos and destruction. The sound echoed across the hillside, a declaration that the defensive line had been breached, that some threat was operating within the perimeter, where no threat should be able to exist. Baker heard shouts from the remaining positions, heard movement as soldiers grabbed weapons and tried to understand where the threat was coming from, what was happening in the darkness around them, why one of their positions had just exploded without any preceding indication of attack. He used that confusion, moving toward the 8th position while defenders were still trying to orient themselves to this new and unexpected situation, while their minds were struggling to reconcile the evidence of internal threat with their assumptions about where threats should come from. Position 8 fell quickly, its defenders so focused on the direction of the explosion from Position 7 that they never saw the threat that came from their own rear, approaching from angles they had not prepared to defend, because those angles should have been protected by positions that no longer existed as functional defensive elements. Baker moved through it with speed that sacrificed some stealth for velocity, understanding that time now mattered more than complete silence, that the defensive system was collapsing and the final position had to be taken before any organized response could form, before defenders could coordinate withdrawal or call for support, that would turn his successful infiltration into fatal trap. He paused just long enough to catch his breath, to take a long drink from his water supply, to let his hands steady and his heart rate slow from the spike that adrenaline had driven it to. One position remained, the 9th bunker, the command position at the top of the hill, the strongest position with the most defenders and the best fields of fire. The position that would be most alert now, most ready, most dangerous because they had heard the explosions, had received fragmentary reports from positions that were now silent, had begun to understand that something catastrophic was happening to their carefully constructed defensive line. The 9th bunker was the most heavily defended, positioned at the top of the hill with commanding views of all approaches that conventional military logic suggested attackers must use. Its defenders had heard the explosions clearly, had attempted to raise positions on the communication network and received only silence, had begun to understand that their defensive network was collapsing around them from some internal threat that made no sense according to their training and experience. They were alert now, weapons ready, searching the darkness for enemies they expected to come from the front, from the obvious approaches, from the directions that military logic dictated assault must come. Baker approached from directly below, from the cliff face that the defenders had dismissed as impassable, using handholds and footholds that would have challenged an experienced rock climber under ideal conditions and seemed almost suicidal to attempt in darkness while carrying combat equipment. But those defenders above him, searching outward for threats, would never imagine someone climbing the face below them, would never think to look down at the supposedly impassable approach that protected their rear as effectively as any wall. He climbed with patience and precision, testing each handhold before committing his weight, moving up the face of the hill like some kind of human spider, utilizing every crack and protrusion until he reached a point directly beneath the bunker's main firing position. The defenders above him were focused outward, searching the approaches, calling to positions that no longer answered, their voices carrying the first hints of panic as they realized their isolation, as they understood that whatever had happened to the other positions might be about to happen to them. Baker pulled himself over the edge, with muscles screaming from fatigue and stress, rolled to his feet with rifle ready, and was inside the bunker before any of them could fully process what was happening, before any mind could reconcile the impossible appearance of threat from a direction that should not permit approach. The position fell in seconds, its defenders overwhelmed by threat, appearing from angles they had not imagined possible, by someone who moved with speed and precision that exceeded their ability to respond. Baker stood in the silence that followed, breathing heavily, his body finally acknowledging the accumulated stress of the previous 3.5 hours. 9 positions, 9 fortified bunkers that had held against repeated assaults by company-sized forces, that represented months of defensive planning and construction by German engineers who understood their craft, neutralized by a single soldier operating alone in darkness, with nothing but skill and determination, and capabilities that seemed to exceed normal human limits. Around him lay evidence of what he had accomplished, but also evidence of the cost paid by men who had been doing their duty as they understood it, defending positions they had been ordered to hold, fighting a conflict whose broader implications most of them probably did not fully grasp. He moved to the bunker's communication equipment, examining the radio sets and telephone systems that had connected these positions into a coordinated network. He sent a prearranged signal to his own lines, 3 short bursts on the radio frequency that indicated mission success. Message received and acknowledged by Reynolds, who had been monitoring throughout the night with increasing anxiety about whether Baker would succeed or whether the silence meant he had been discovered and killed somewhere in the German defensive network. Then Baker settled in to wait for dawn and the arrival of friendly forces who would secure the positions he had cleared, who would transform his tactical success into strategic advantage that would allow the supply route to open and the advance to continue. The wait felt longer than the infiltration itself, alone in hostile territory with nothing to do but sit and think about what he had done, about the lives he had ended, about the risk he had accepted and somehow survived. He did not feel triumph, did not feel the satisfaction that victory might suggest. He felt tired, felt the weight of what violence demanded, even in justified cause, felt the particular loneliness that comes from operating alone in circumstances where any error would have meant death with no one to witness or report what had happened. The first friendly soldiers arrived as the sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the hillside that had been contested for days. They moved cautiously, expecting resistance despite the radio message, unable to believe the reports that all positions had been neutralized without their hearing any extended firefight, any indication of the kind of combat that clearing 9 fortified positions should have required. When they found Baker sitting calmly in the command bunker, surrounded by evidence of what he had accomplished, their expressions cycled through disbelief, amazement, and a kind of awed respect that transcended the usual boundaries of military hierarchy and the prejudices that segregation tried to enforce. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds arrived shortly after, with several senior officers, who had heard reports of the night's action and needed to see the evidence firsthand, needed to verify that what seemed impossible had actually occurred. They walked through the positions, noting the precision of Baker's work, the minimal damage to the fortifications themselves, which could now be used by American forces, the efficiency that spoke to extraordinary skill and courage operating at levels that exceeded anything their experience had prepared them to recognize. Reynolds approached Baker with an expression that suggested he was struggling to find words adequate to what he wanted to express, struggling to articulate the magnitude of what this one soldier had accomplished while operating alone in hostile territory against defended positions. "You cleared 9 positions," Reynolds finally said, his voice carrying unusual emotion for an officer trained to maintain professional detachment. 9 fortified bunkers by yourself in less than 4 hours. Do you understand how impossible that should have been? Do you comprehend what you have accomplished here? Baker shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both humility and awareness of what he had achieved, both recognition of the mission's significance and reluctance to aggrandize his own role. It was possible because they were not expecting threat from those angles, he said simply. They had built their defenses to stop frontal assault, and they did that job extremely well, would have stopped any conventional attack we might have launched. But no defensive system is perfect, no matter how well planned or constructed. Every strength creates weakness somewhere else, and I was able to identify and exploit those weaknesses before they could adapt their defenses to account for unconventional approaches. Over the following weeks, as American forces consolidated their hold on the area and continued their advance through increasingly contested territory, stories began filtering back through intelligence channels about the German response to that night, about how enemy forces were trying to understand what had happened to a defensive network that should have been impregnable. Captured soldiers spoke of the confusion, the fear, the sense that they had been facing something beyond normal combat capability, some threat that operated according to rules they did not understand. Some called Baker's accomplishment impossible, even after being shown the evidence, suggesting that multiple infiltrators must have been involved, that no single person could have achieved what the physical evidence clearly showed had occurred. But others, particularly those who had survived the assault and been taken prisoner in subsequent actions, had a different characterization. They spoke of seeing, in the moments before positions fell, a shadow that moved unlike any soldier they had encountered before, a presence that seemed to materialize from darkness itself, with capabilities that exceeded anything their training had prepared them to face. One German officer, interviewed extensively by American intelligence personnel seeking to understand enemy perspectives and capabilities, used a phrase that would eventually find its way into both official reports and the unofficial legend that would grow around Baker's accomplishment. They called him the invisible Negro, the officer said, and his tone carried no mockery, no derision, only a kind of wary respect, born from having his tactical assumptions destroyed by someone whose capabilities exceeded anything his training had prepared him to face or even imagine as possible. They could not understand how he appeared where he should not be, how he moved through positions that should have detected any approach, how he neutralized defenses that should have been adequate against any individual threat. Some of them began to believe he possessed abilities beyond the normal, that he represented something they had no framework to comprehend, that he was somehow more than simply a skilled soldier employing superior tactics. Back in the American lines, Baker's accomplishment was documented in after-action reports that praised his initiative, courage, and tactical brilliance in terms that should have guaranteed immediate recognition. His commanding officers, from Reynolds up through multiple levels of hierarchy, recommended him for the Medal of Honor, the highest recognition American military could provide, the award reserved for valor above and beyond the call of duty under circumstances of extreme danger. The recommendations were detailed, specific, supported by multiple witnesses and physical evidence of what had been accomplished. But those recommendations would become entangled in the prejudices and politics that characterized the military's treatment of African American soldiers even while they fought and died for their country. The medal would not be awarded, not then, not for decades afterward, though everyone directly involved understood what he had earned through demonstrated capability and extraordinary courage. The recommendations would be reviewed and set aside, or lost in bureaucratic processes, or simply ignored by officers whose prejudices would not allow them to acknowledge that a soldier of African descent could accomplish what white soldiers had failed to achieve. Baker himself seemed less concerned with recognition than with simply continuing his duty, continuing to serve effectively in circumstances that tested every soldier's capabilities and courage. He returned to his unit, participated in subsequent operations as the war ground toward its conclusion, and continued demonstrating the same capabilities that had enabled his extraordinary infiltration. Other soldiers sought his advice, asked him to teach them his methods, tried to understand how he achieved what he achieved through some combination of training and natural ability and experience that seemed to transcend normal human limits. He was patient with these requests, sharing what could be taught through instruction and practice, while understanding that some elements of his skill derived from experiences and perspectives that could not be easily transferred through any training program. The war continued its grinding progress across Europe, months of fighting that would eventually lead to conclusion, to victory, to the enormous task of rebuilding what conflict had destroyed and attempting to create systems that might prevent such catastrophic violence from recurring. Baker survived, though many of his comrades did not, and eventually returned to America, carrying memories of what he had done, what he had witnessed, what he had proven about capability and courage in circumstances where both were tested beyond what peacetime society could possibly prepare people for. He found America largely unchanged in its treatment of African Americans who had served, who had fought and died in segregated units, who had demonstrated capabilities equal or superior to white soldiers, but received neither recognition nor opportunity proportionate to their service. He found a country still deeply divided by racism, still maintaining systems that denied opportunity based on skin color, still refusing to acknowledge the full humanity and capability of citizens whose only difference was ancestry and appearance. The uniforms came off, the medals that were awarded went into drawers, and the men who had fought returned to a society that often treated them as second-class citizens regardless of their service. Baker lived quietly for decades, working various jobs, maintaining connections with fellow veterans who shared understanding of what service had meant and cost, watching as the country slowly, inadequately, began addressing the systemic racism that had characterized military service during the war. He watched as historians began documenting the full scope of African American contributions to the war effort, as scholars revealed the extent to which capable soldiers had been denied recognition they had clearly earned. As the military itself began acknowledging that prejudice had corrupted its evaluation systems and prevented capable personnel from receiving recognition that competence and courage had earned. Decades later, in 1997, a review of military records from the war revealed the systematic nature of discrimination in awarding recognition, revealed how African American soldiers had been held to different and higher standards than white soldiers performing similar actions, revealed how recommendations for medals had been routinely downgraded or denied based on prejudice rather than evaluation of actual performance. Baker, by then an elderly man who had lived a quiet life after the conflict, who had never sought attention or recognition beyond what his actions had earned, was among those finally awarded the Medal of Honor in a ceremony that acknowledged both his extraordinary actions and the profound injustice of delayed recognition. President Clinton placed the medal around Baker's neck in the White House in a ceremony attended by military officials and fellow veterans and historians who understood the significance of what was being acknowledged. Baker accepted the honor with the same quiet dignity he had displayed throughout his military service and subsequent life. He spoke briefly about that night in June 1944, about the 9 positions cleared while operating alone behind enemy lines, about doing what seemed necessary in circumstances that permitted no other option if the mission was to succeed. He acknowledged that recognition mattered, that having his accomplishments finally acknowledged officially carried meaning. But he suggested that the real significance of what he had done lay not in medals or public glory, but in demonstrating that capability and courage were not determined by the prejudices others held, that a man's worth was measured by his actions rather than by others' preconceptions about what people who looked like him could or could not accomplish. He spoke of the other African American soldiers who had served with distinction, many of whom had not survived to see recognition finally granted, many of whose accomplishments remained undocumented or unrecognized, even with the belated acknowledgement being offered. The German soldiers who had nicknamed him the Invisible Negro had understood something profound, even if they lacked full context for their understanding. They had encountered excellence in circumstances where they did not expect it, from a source they had been taught to dismiss, in forms their training had not prepared them to understand or counter. They had built defenses they believed adequate, had positioned themselves to stop expected threats, had created systems they thought would protect them against any individual infiltration. And they had been proven wrong, had watched their defensive network collapse under assault from someone who moved through their positions as though the obstacles they relied on did not exist. That encounter, that collision between expectation and reality, that moment when prejudice confronted capability and was found utterly inadequate, carried implications far beyond the immediate tactical situation. It suggested that the assumptions societies held about human capacity, about who could accomplish what, about the boundaries that supposedly separated exceptional from ordinary, were themselves suspect, were themselves subject to revision when reality demonstrated their inadequacy through accomplished fact that could not be denied or explained away. Baker's story eventually found wider audience through books and documentaries, through academic studies and military analysis, through the gradual work of historians documenting the full scope of African American contributions to the war effort that official records had systematically minimized or ignored. Each retelling added context, added detail, added understanding of what his accomplishment meant, both militarily and socially, both as tactical success and as demolition of assumptions about capability and race. Military analysts studied his infiltration as case study in individual initiative, in exploitation of defensive blind spots, in the psychology of defenders expecting threat from particular directions. They analyzed his route selection, his timing, his methods for neutralizing positions without alerting adjacent defenses. They used his example to teach broader lessons about defensive vulnerabilities, about the limitations of static positions, however well constructed, about the importance of maintaining vigilance against unconventional threats, even when conventional approaches seem to account for all dangers. But perhaps the most important lesson was simpler than tactical analysis suggested. Perhaps the lesson was that human capability, when tested under extreme circumstances, can exceed what doctrine and theory predict as possible. That individuals, given opportunity and necessity, can accomplish what conventional wisdom insists cannot be done by solo operators. That the boundaries we believe constrain human potential are often revealed as artificial, when someone possesses both the ability and the will to demonstrate their inadequacy through direct action that produces results speaking louder than any theoretical argument. The 9 bunkers cleared in darkness by a soldier moving alone through hostile territory represented one such demonstration. They stood as testament to what became possible when assumptions collapsed before accomplished fact, when prejudice encountered capability it could not deny, when a man nicknamed by his enemies for his seemingly impossible skills proved that the impossible was merely the unattempted, that what doctrine insisted could not be done could in fact be accomplished by someone with sufficient skill and determination and willingness to accept extraordinary risk in pursuit of mission success. Vernon Baker left a legacy that transcended military achievement, that spoke to larger questions about human potential and the artificial limits that societies try to impose based on prejudice rather than demonstrated capability. He proved through action what words alone could never fully convey, demonstrated through accomplished fact what theory insisted was impossible, and in doing so contributed not just to tactical victory, but to the broader struggle for recognition that African American soldiers had earned through service and sacrifice, but been systematically denied through prejudice that corrupted every system it touched. His story reminds us that capability exists independent of others' willingness to acknowledge it, that excellence can emerge from unexpected sources and confound those who believe they understand the full range of human potential, that the most profound victories sometimes come not from conventional approaches, but from individuals who operate outside expected parameters and achieve what others insisted could not be done. The nickname his enemies gave him, born from fear and bewilderment at facing capabilities they could not explain, became tribute to excellence that transcended the prejudices both sides brought to conflict, that demonstrated humanity's capacity to exceed supposed limits when circumstances demand and character provides. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.